everybody. Welcome to this seminar organized by EUFORGEN and the EFI. My name is Jeremy Cherfus. I'm going to be facilitating this, and there are a couple of messages I want to put out right at the beginning. First of all, we are recording this for later broadcast, not broadcast, but making it publicly available, and it will be edited, but to let you know that everybody it will be recorded. The second thing is that we're going to have two keynote speakers first, and then a discussion among the 5 panelists. I will introduce everybody as they speak. If you have a question for the panelists, I ask you to put it in the question and answer box, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. And then when the time comes, after all the panelists have spoken, we will go around and examine the various questions and see whether we can get some answers to those. So let's begin now with the first keynote speaker from Jens Hertel. Jens Hertel works as a policy advisor for the liaison unit in Bonn of the Forest Europe process, and his focus is on the work towards the pan-European forest risk knowledge mechanism, which is going to strengthen transboundary cooperation to support forest adaptation to climate change. Jens is going to speak about how the political framework is key to support sustainable forest management as a basis for the availability, conservation, and sustainable use of forest genetic resources. So, Jens.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy, for the very kind introduction. Dear ladies and gentlemen, also from my side and on behalf of LUBO, the Liaison Unit Bonn, a warm welcome to the webinar Manage to Conserve Forest Genetic Resource Conservation as part of forest management.
C'est bon. Merci.
I think you can hear me. Yeah, okay, obviously there was just a noise in the background. But before going into detail, I would like to start with the situation that obviously European forests are of utmost importance for all of us based on the existential forest goods and services they provide, such as timber, non-timber forest products, carbon storage, nutrient cycling, obviously also water and air purification or maintenance of wildlife habitat. Yet, and that's also very obvious, forests need to be healthy to provide the great services and products which we all appreciate so much. And in current times, all over Europe, we had to witness that healthy forests cannot be taken for granted because storms, wildfire, insects, droughts, and others severely reduce forest health and result in omnipresent forest damages when we look at European forests in general, but particularly also including genetic conservation units. Unfortunately, these influences on forest health are predicted to be additionally fueled by climate change in the future. And therefore, scientists, foresters, and also politicians all over Europe are intensively working on possible solutions to minimize forest damages and to adapt European forests to climate change. Genetic diversity ensures that forest ecosystems can adapt and evolve under changing environmental conditions and herewith maintain and support the different goods and services of forests. And already 32 years ago, European ministers responsible for forests adopted the resolution Strasbourg II, which is called Conservation of Forest Genetic Resources in the framework of the Ministerial Conference for the Protection of Forests in Europe, today known as Forest Europe. Hereby, the Forest Europe signatories expressed their endeavor for a close cooperation on conservation of genetic diversity of European forests to promote and also coordinate, firstly, in situ and ex situ conservation of forest genetic resources, secondly, exchange of forest reproductive material, and third, to monitor progress in these fields together with the European Forest Genetic Resource Program, so-called today EUFORGEN. And this resulted in a very productive and close cooperation for over 3 decades already. And this webinar today is a very good example of this very close cooperation. And in addition, Forest Europe embraced the importance to promote the conservation of forest genetic resources as an integral part of sustainable forest management and to continue the pan-European collaboration in this area in many high-level political events, such as the Ministerial Conference in Vienna in 2003, and also the Ministerial Conference in Warsaw in 2007, or in Madrid in 2015. Based on the Madrid resolution, protection of forests in a changing environment, countries also committed to implement EUFORGEN's conservation strategy at national level and to promote national implementation of strategies and guidelines for dynamic conservation and appropriate use of forest genetic resources under changing climate conditions. And these key examples of pan-European policy commitments underline the importance of forest genetic resource conservation as part of SFM and its importance as one of the key pillars to develop appropriate forest-related strategies and measures to minimize risk and damages, as well as to adapt European forests to climate change. In 2021, adopted, the Bratislava Ministerial Resolution sets a joint commitment to connect national and also international activities to work towards a coordinated pan-European forest risk knowledge mechanism, in short terms, FORESC. And this FORESC aims to support the adaptation of forests to changing climate and also site conditions, and to enhance forest resilience as well as the adaptation potential of European forests. And in this very context, Forest Europe aims to support the national efforts to, among others, strengthen the national implementation of policies, tools, and measures for the protection, conservation, and appropriate use of forest genetic resource in order to contribute to the adaptation of forests to changing climate and also site conditions, and also to facilitate research in the fields of protection of genetic diversity, adaptation of forests and forest management to climate change, which includes testing and selecting of species and suitable proveniences for future conditions in line with international recommendations on invasive alien species, as well as on forest damage. In this regard, the demand related to evidence-based and sound information and recommendations with policy relevance on forest genetic resource conservation is constantly increasing and developing based on very rapid environmental, but also societal characteristics. As an important reference, the legislative and political frameworks are also further developing. In order to provide the most relevant information to the ministers and policymakers, Forest Europe and other high-level processes require, wherever possible, large transdisciplinary and also transboundary research effort. Therefore, the reconfirmed commitment by the Forest Europe signatories related to the dynamic conservation and utilization of forestry genetic resources and also the management of forestry species populations for the production of forest reproductive material, as well as to continue pan-European collaboration on forest genetic resources through EUFORGEN, based on the Bratislava Ministerial Declaration, the future we want, the forests we need, is very, very essential. Based on the severe influences of the changing climate conditions, current demands on more timely forest genetic resource information, based on, for example, long-term monitoring, is also key at different levels. In order to allow for timely political decision-making while maintaining at the same time suitable effort for monitoring, assessing, and reporting information related to forest genetic resources, an efficient and ongoing development of monitoring procedures is very essential. Therefore, for example, innovative monitoring solutions might be a promising and also important way forward for the future. When looking at forest ecosystems in the context of climate change, also a deepened exchange on supplement assessing levels related to forest genetic resources becomes also important. Also particularly when assessing forest resilience and forest adaptation. Here too, a broadened focus which cover the comprehensive potential of forest ecosystems, but also looking at promising adaptation and also very important evolutionary potentials of forest genetic resources, provide valuable information related to adaptation and forest resilience, particularly also in the context of policy making. Furthermore, the consideration of connecting different forest monitoring applications, such as forest genetic resource data, connected with biodiversity monitoring, might also support a very holistic assessment. Finally, the facilitation of appropriate reproductive material in the context of SFM is important to further elaborate to further elaborate appropriate legal frameworks in order to maintain and strengthen forest health, forest resilience, and forest adaptation. Yet when elaborating the role of policymaking related to forest genetic resources, one aspect is very obvious. Close cooperation with all relevant forest stakeholders, particularly scientists and practitioners, is essential. In addition, Forest Europe will continue to highlight the importance of forest genetic resources in the context of sustainable forest management throughout the political dialogue at pan-European but also global level. Therefore, Forest Europe is currently working towards the coordinated forest, which shall also facilitate a collaborative and transparent knowledge exchange between forest-related stakeholders to strengthen the adaptation of pan-European forests. Since the 1st of September this year, the forest pilot is officially launched, which focuses on wildfires, pests and diseases, and also storms in the context of individual pilot phases, as well as on the interrelations of forest risk drivers. Here too, an overarching forest focus will also involve the complex interlinkages of forest risks in order to synthesize and provide long-term support related to forest resilience and adaptation, where also SFM and the integral role of forest genetic resource conservation is one of the very fundamental pillars of the needed solutions. Today's webinar is an important initiative to further stimulate the information transfer and networking among key stakeholders to further develop and facilitate the conservation of forest genetic resources, which is also essential in the context of the preparation of the EUFORGEN report, adaptation of genetic conservation units to climate change, which will be also a very important input for the work towards the forest risk knowledge mechanism. I look very much forward to the upcoming contributions and your vivid participation related to this very fundamental topic. Thank you very much, and back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jens, for that clear explanation of the policy and practical implications of much of the work going on across Europe on sustainable forest management. I'd now like to introduce Anna Maria Fasoglou, who is a researcher at the EUFORGEN Secretariat. Her scientific background includes forest genetics and genomics and the conservation and sustainable use of forest genetic resources and climate change. She was part of the coordinating team for the development of the forest genetic resources strategy for Europe, launched last year, and she's going to present her keynote on what will the strategy for forest genetic resources conservation do for a successful adaptation of European forests to climate change. Anna Maria?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome from the EUFORGEN side as well. As Jeremy said, I will present you today what will the strategy actually do for the European forest in order to adapt to climate change. But let's bring you all to the same page first. So first, I will start from what is EUFORGEN, for those that are not really aware of. So EUFORGEN is an international cooperation program, and it forms a unique platform because it promotes the dialogue among science, policy, and practice, and it develops strategies and defines priorities for conservation and sustainable use of forest genetic resources in Europe. So as Jens explained, EUFORGEN's mandate comes directly through the Forest Europe and the different ministerial conferences. And EUFORGEN member countries, you can see them in dark green, and in light green, you can see also the countries that have signed the different Forest Europe resolutions. So the latest EUFORGEN product is the Forest Genetic Resources Strategy for Europe. We already have a Forest Genetic Resources Strategy for conservation, and it was published back in 2015. But with this new strategy, we have an integrated approach. So we now consider both conservation and sustainable use of forest genetic resources. We include genetic information in order to define different conservation targets. We set priorities for conservation, and we define the role of the EUFORGEN network and the different European countries. And today I will focus more on the chapter of conservation of forest and genetic resources. And the conservation of forest genetic resources in Europe is mainly done through in situ conservation and our genetic conservation units, which are formed by different representative forested areas. And when this is not possible, then we are chosen ex situ conservation. So in order to define a genetic conservation unit, as I said, we need to have a forestry area with a designated status and a minimum population size. We also identify target tree species for each unit. We need to have a basic management plan for genetic conservation and to monitor those units. For that, within EUFORGEN, we host an EUFORGEN, which is our information system, and it hosts more than 3,200 GCUs, around 4,000 forestry populations of more than 100 different species. And how can we achieve actually an effective conservation of our genetic resources in Europe? In order to maintain the adaptive diversity, we need to keep in mind that the genetic characteristics, they vary within each species. So if we overlap just 3 forestry species, and these are, for example, here, Pinus sylvestris, Quercus robur, and Fraximus angustifolia, we need to think that trees, they do not recognize political borders. So just overlapping these 3 different distribution ranges, we are covering the whole European continent. And we need to be sure that the conservation of our genetic resources needs a pan-European perspective. So why is it important to manage those genetic conservation units? We need to mitigate the effects of climate change and to favor the different genetic processes. And we need to do that in order to maintain the long-term viability of the forestry populations. For that, and to support this, we have also developed a decision support tool for the management of dynamic genetic conservation units. And this is helping the different management authorities to detect the different threats or needs that each GCU has. And to go straight into the topic of today, I will leave you with 2 different important questions that the panel will cover for you. So, what kind of risks can arise when limited intervention is allowed in an old growth forest? And how can we define actions to be taken in an old growth forest, especially when an old growth forest is also a GCU and contains important genetic diversity? And thank you very much, and back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. And you raise at the end a crucial point, which brings us to here today, which is the need for conservation of genetic resources and the need for conservation in a wider arena. And to address that, we have 5 panelists who are representing, in addition to their countries, also different organizations. As I said at the outset, if you have questions for the panelists and for the keynote speakers, but mostly for the panelists, I invite you to put them into the Q&A box that you find at the bottom of your screen. But let's start with the first panelist, Felipe Perez. Felipe is the head of Forest Genetic Resources Area in the Directorate General of Biodiversity, Forest and Desertification in the Spanish Ministry of Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge. He's the national coordinator for EUFORGEN in Spain, and he's in charge of the coordination of the GCU network in Spain and the regulation of GCUs at the national level. So, Felipe.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank to the organization of this event. for being able to participate and give my point of view in these topics. As I'm representing Forest Europe signatory countries, as regards of the issues of old-growth forests and conservation of forest genetic resources, and specifically of genetic conservation units network, and its relation with Forest Europe role about sustainable forest management, in my opinion, it is crucial to take into account the following important resolution of the process of Forest Europe and Ministerial Conference related with conservation of biological diversity and adaptation to climate change. Some of them have been mentioned previously by Jens Hartel. First of all, we have the resolution S2 in Strasbourg, genetic resources. Another important one from my point of view is the resolution in Helsinki conference H4, adaptation of forests in Europe to climate change. There are more, for instance, in Vienna, forest biological diversity. And finally, for me, it's important, the resolution in Madrid about protection of forests in changing environment that was mentioned before. It's important to take into account criteria and indicator of sustainable forest management that are established in Forest Europe in relation with this topic we are dealing. Especially the criterion for forest biological diversity that includes, among others, different indicators such as 4.3 naturalness of forests, the indicator 4.6 genetic resources, or indicator 4.9 protected forests. What is remarkable is that it's important considering biodiversity conservation at all levels: ecosystems or habitats, species, and genetic in the context of sustainable forest management and adaptation of forests to climate change. Old-growth forests have important values and must to be preserved and promoted in the level of ecosystem and habitat conservation, and also on the level of species. But on the other hand, genetic conservation units network preserves the level of genetic diversity of tree species, and it is vital for the conservation, adaptation, and resilience of forests. And it is possible because they promote the evolution of the forest in a context of a dynamic in situ management. Taking this into account, conflicts between old-growth forests and genetic conservation units shouldn't cease, as it is important to present both figures, as all the levels of biological diversity should be preserved and promoted. As a conclusion, and in my opinion, a list of permitted activities in old-growth forests should be clarified and defined. The activities that contribute to conservation of their own ecosystem and also the population of forest trees should be allowed. In my opinion, activities related to management for conservation activities, specifically a conservation of forest genetic resources, should be one of the activities permitted. But what happens with other activities that can put in danger the singular population of trees, and for this reason the whole ecosystem in general, such as forest fire prevention in Mediterranean area with the removal of part of the fuel vegetation or control of pests and diseases, should they be permitted in general? This is a question that I launched to the public in general and for this webinar. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. I think that's the crucial question. I mean, what you said at the end there is the crucial question that we're all trying to come to grips with here. Thank you for that reminder that if anyone in the audience has questions for Felipe or anyone else, they can put them in the question and answer box. We move now to Marita Russanen from the Natural Resources Institute in Finland, where she's responsible for the national program on forest genetic resources conservation. She's also the national coordinator for the EUFORGEN program. And in addition to serving on the EUFORGEN steering committee, she's taken part in various EUFORGEN working groups over the past decade, and will share some of her experience and questions with us now. Thank you. Marie.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, thank you for this invitation to this panel and an opportunity to represent the EUFORGEN community here. And unfortunately, the time will not allow me to present all the various ways of implementing genetic conservation in European countries and all the cases. So I will just present one example from my own work in Finland, where we actually have experienced problems with consolidating old forest protection and genetic conservation. And this is mainly because habitat conservation normally does not allow for interventions, whereas genetic conservation needs to have an option for management. So our national conservation program was started already in 1992. And at the moment, we consider that our network of in situ conservation stands is more or less finalized. And indeed, it's very difficult to identify any new suitable areas for genetic conservation. So our main ambition at the moment is to keep the network we have and maintain all the GCUs in good shape. And maybe it's also good to mention for those who don't know that the national program in Finland is based on voluntary contracts with the landowners. So there's no regulations or subsidies involved in this work. So the reality is that now that we have our network and we want to keep it, we have analyzed potential threats to individual GCUs. And the threats we have been able to identify are, for example, change in the land ownership, change in the land management policies, and this is mostly like highway construction or power line construction. Then mining industry, which is very powerful in Finland, and then paradoxically, nature conservation. And actually, from these, the nature conservation is considered to be the biggest threat and is the only one that has been realized during the past 30 years we have had our program. So we actually have been forced to remove a conservation stand from our network. And this happened when this same forest was put on the old forest protection program, and therefore we were not able to manage it anymore to ensure sufficient regeneration. And the program I'm referring here is our national program for old forest, and this is already from year 1993, so this is not the new EU initiative. However, new programs are emerging, and currently we consider 2 more genetic conservation units to be threatened by nature conservation now that new areas are selected for habitat conservation. So before I stop, I still want to stress that I do consider old forests very valuable, and I understand that they need protection. It is just that in my mind, this should not overrule genetic conservation and our existing program, and rather we need to find a way to reconcile the different interests, and there should be room for both types of conservation with their own specific needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, with your pointing out there the need for compromise and perhaps some flexibility in future. I want to move now to Mariana Westergren, who is a researcher at the Slovenian Forestry Institute in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Mariana has a background in forestry engineering and population genetics, and she works on the conservation and sustainable use of forest genetic resources. She contributes to several national and international projects for Genius, OptForests, and to networks, including EUFORGEN as a Division 2 Deputy Coordinator, as well as Eveltree and EUFORGEN itself. So, Mariana, please.
Thank you, Jeremy, and hello from me too. You know, listening to what was said, I have to keep reminding myself that old growth forest is not the same as primeval forest, and I wanted just to start with that because I have learned last week that old growth forests are not this is not exactly the same in terms of the new definitions being developed, and that the old growth forests are forests that were managed sometime in the future, but they have been abandoned to management in the past, and they are trying. You know, they are going to be left to natural development, and this is something that I have been struggling with because I was asking myself, why would you manage primeval forests, because they are the last remnants that we have. And last week I realized that this is not the same thing. But going from that, I would like to make 2 points in this address to you. And the first one is that genetic diversity is the foundation of all biodiversity. So it's the basic building block of species biodiversity and of ecosystem biodiversity. And it is also the fuel for adaptation to climate change, to novel pests, to novel diseases. And natural selection operates through this available genetic diversity, and it goes from one generation to the next. And therefore, the regeneration of forests is necessary for this adaptation to different forces to take place. And the shorter the cycle between one generation to the other, the faster the potential adaptation. Now, this adaptation, if it will happen or not, depends on other factors too, but the fuel for it is genetic diversity. And the second point I want to make is that if necessary, certain silvicultural actions may help this natural regeneration. So they may induce seed production, they facilitate regeneration through making openings in the canopy, and they can also contribute to a more diverse regeneration. And for this reason, I think management should not be excluded per se from forest stands which purpose is conservation of genetic diversity, even if they are old growth forests, because sometimes we may need it. So that would be the 2 messages that I wanted to give to you. Thank you, and back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much for clarifying the distinction there between primeval forest and old growth forest, because that's something I know I was quite confused about too. Thank you, Mariana. Next, we move to Brigitte Mouche, who works for the Research and Development Department of the National Forestry Agency in France. She's contributed to the establishment of genetic resources conservation networks on a national scale, and her role within the agency is to adapt forests to climate change. She's involved in situ and pseudo in situ conservation of genetic resources threatened by global warming. So, Brigitte.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Mary and Philippe have explained well the problem that can arise for GCU. What I would like is to present you a case where we are able to find a solution for GCU and how with a scientific result manager can work together. My example is on Fagus sylvatica beach species. First of all, the studies on history of forest species have identified a major refugia area during the last glacial periods, but small secondary refuges may also have existed, as shown by pollen or seeds. For beach in France, secondary refuges could be identified, for example, near Bordeaux or Marseille, where you can't normally find a beach now. This population now are completely isolated from the rest of the beach forest, often more than 100 kilometers. For that, there are very particular habitat on the riverside for Bordeaux population and next to the Mediterranean scrubland for Marseille. There are very special forests with admixture of species, without such also need to be conserved. Then different types of protection are therefore required, which are not always compatible. In the case of the sandboom near Marseille, the unit have been identified in the early 1990 and registered at national level. The protection of the habitat of the sandboom was then directly in favor of beach, which allow the two status to coexist without any problems. But from 2010, the importance of the habitat was reconsidered and the approach changed. A project of integral reserve was born at the sandboom, including the conservation units. So, in our point of view, the long-term conservation of the beach was no longer guaranteed. Indeed, with the global warming in this beach forest is beginning to decline. The adult trees are dying, but no regeneration is taking place. The hypothesis that is currently advanced is the lack of gaps does not allow regeneration to take place. So to ensure the maintenance of the beach forest, it is therefore required to make cuttings or plantation, which the statute of integral reserve does not allow. So the easiest solution was to move either the reserve or the conservation unit within the forest, so that the two conservation statutes didn't overlap. But it's not possible because not all the forests contain sufficient beach to ensure the proper functioning of conservation units. On the other hand, the richness of the habitat is largely related to beach forests. The compromise that we reached was to exclude the core area of the conservation unit from the integral reserve. Thus, on several hectares, forestry action can be carried out to maintain a dynamic population. On the other hand, the buffer zone that will remain untouched spent samples of plant material can be taken and seed collected. The seeds can then be used to enrich the core zone of the unit if it's necessary. The particular case of the sandboom will certainly be a repeat for many of our units in marginal solution. And a positive outcome of this case gives us hope, and we can avoid the conflict. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. That's very interesting and very hopeful, I think. for the future that you can reach a compromise. Finally, we turn to Peter Löffler, who is a policy officer in the Adaptation and Resilience to Climate Change Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action, DG Klima. His responsibilities include climate adaptation and resilience in EU forests, biodiversity, nature conservation, and health policies, and the European Climate Adapt Knowledge Exchange platform. Peter.
Okay, many thanks, Jeremy, and hello to everyone in the room. Thanks for having me. Allow me, before I come, say a few words about old growth forests, and in order to broaden the view a bit, and because I come really from DG Klima and the adaptation unit, to say just a few words about climate adaptation in general, and then I come to old growth forests. On adaptation in general, really, what we have been seeing in the last 2 or 3 years, really, is that climate impacts are coming close to home. They happen faster than most scientists would have expected. No area and no sector is left. And we start also to realize that climate effects are, they are compound and cascading, they are transborder, they are cross sectors. So that, for example, the drought which we have been experiencing this year translates into problems with energy provision, health issues, food security problems, and of course also the impact on forests. And really, in a way, these impacts are, though, not unexpected, and they're also not unusual. I mean, this is basically the new reality in which we are, and they will continue. We are just at the beginning of this. And forests are really a case in point. I mean, we have been experiencing very significant disasters already in forests in the last few years. We had a significant loss of canopy cover in Germany in the drought years 2018, 2019. And I don't, let's see what we get from this year. We had this year a new wildfire record. We had the worst wildfire season to date since wildfire records exist. We had the bark beetle outbreaks. And so forests are already impacted, and they will start to transform further. They are highly vulnerable, they're exposed, and many tree species and many forests are both exposed and vulnerable to climate change. So we do have an overarching policy on adaptation to climate change in the EU. We have an adaptation strategy. We also have a climate law, which now makes adaptation actually a legal duty, both for the EU institutions and for member states. Forest adaptation as such is feasible in most cases, but the exact how is, of course, the challenge. And what we also see in forest adaptation is, again, adapting forests, protecting forests for their biodiversity, and using forests, for example, as a carbon sink, what we call mitigation. You cannot separate these anymore. They're closely linked to one another. And so we have adaptation of forests, and also, of course, the questions which we're dealing with today, old growth forest protection and genetic conservation, prominent in the relevant EU strategies. So they are touched on in the EU biodiversity strategy, in the EU adaptation strategy, and also in the EU forest strategy, of course. And so these are work sort of combined. And then under these strategies, we've got many interesting policy developments, which I think also relevant really to the community here in this room today. We do not only focus on post-disaster recovery and disaster response, like wildfire fighting this year. We also work on a European-wide climate risk assessment, which will include a chapter on forests, which will be published in early 2024. We have the Commission has put out its proposal for a nature restoration law, which is, I think, quite a significant initiative. We work under the forest strategy on guidelines and guidance on nature conservation, old growth forest protection. We have an ongoing, soon to be published legal proposal on to review the EU framework for forest reproductive material. And we have also in the pipeline our plans to put out a legal proposal on forest monitoring and strategic planning. And forest genetic resources, I would argue, have to play a role in all of them. But okay, now coming back to old growth forest, really, that comes very much inspired by the EU biodiversity strategy. Some of you may know the strategy put out an objective of protecting 30% of land ecosystems in the EU, and of these 30%, 1/3, i.e. 10 percentage points, to protect them strictly. There is a chapter in the biodiversity strategy on old growth forest protection for the really unique values which these forests represent, and for the very few forests with these qualities which we have left in Europe. What happens under sort of these provisions to protect and with this focus on old growth forests is there is currently a working group composed together with member states, forest stakeholders, and commission services, which is developing a definition of old growth forest as opposed to primary forest. And Mariana indicated that already. I think the key difference is really that primary forests sort of were never really touched by man. Old growth forests, were touched by human activity at some stage in their history. And there probably is not going to be a single cut-off date for Europe, because we've got so many and so different forests. But that's sort of the main distinction. So it's basically very, very old forests in which natural processes dominate, and should be left actually to dominate in order for these forests to have their unique values sort of conserved. So there is the definition. From the definition, there would then be an exercise of mapping. We still do not have a complete map of old growth and primary forests in Europe. Then comes the question, of course, what do we do with these forests and how do we protect them? And here the interesting thing is, and it would be very unfortunate if the protection of old growth forest would work against the genetic conservation units, or the protection of genetic resources for forests, because the two should be together. The notion of strict protection, there is a definition, for example, in what we call a staff working document on the new protected areas. Strict protection means, of course, that you refrain from major activities which would prevent natural processes from happening. But yes, there are possibilities, there are exceptions for activities that either do not interfere with natural processes or that enhance them. There is also an acknowledgement that activities and even in strictly protected areas are authorized if they help preserve or restore the natural values of these areas. And I would argue that a genetic conservation unit is one of those values that are to be restored. And so I think this is, I'm not DG Environment, but I spoke to my colleagues from DG Environment, and they would consider this is one of those cases where we have a clear case to say, yes, we do what is necessary to preserve, the genetic conservation unit, respecting as much as possible, of course, the overall protection objective of the old growth forest. Yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to sort of feed into the debate. But I think we're moving to the debate now, so I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, we're moving forward now to some questions, some additional questions. I'd just like to summarize briefly that what we've heard from the panelists is the value of forest genetic resources for future adaptation, for the sustainable use and management of forests, and the need occasionally, maybe not every year, certainly not every year, to manage genetic conservation units precisely because they are dynamic conservation units. And we've had examples of good and bad interactions with nature conservation, strict conservation, sometimes not so strict conservation. But I'd like to explore now some of the nuances of this by first asking Felipe if he has any. Felipe, do you have any examples of how, in your experience, you've gone about solving the conflict between conservation of species, species protected areas, with the conservation of GCUs, which Peter has just said should be possible.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. This problem, or this kind of conflicts with GCUs, we observed previously in Spain, not with old-growth forest conservation, because we don't have a national program, or we didn't have about a national program about it. But we observed it with other kind of protection areas, protected areas, such as national parks, some areas in the zonation of natural parks, reserves, or other kind. In some of them, sometimes there are strict protection, and we realized that it was necessary to have a legislation that regulates the genetic conservation units for their approval, management, and monitoring. And this year we approved finally a decree about it. In case of protected areas and habitats of the species, we try to delimit the genetic conservation units out of these areas in order to avoid this kind of conflicts. In our legislation of GCUs, we have established that for the previous approval of these units, it has to be it is mandatory a report of the biodiversity or environmental conservation departments that in the case of Spain is in the autonomous region that have the competence in the territory. And they have to participate actively in the elaboration of the guidelines of management and monitoring of each unit, each genetic conservation unit. It can be difficult, it can be hard at this stage at the beginning now, but in our opinion, it has the advantage to avoid possible conflicts in the future, and to integrate the management plans of these units in other management plans in the territory in general, even management plans of forestry and silviculturals. So it's more or less this example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question that's come up is about the definition of old-growth forest, and Peter Loeffler was saying that there will be a document published, but Mr. van der Klover from the audience has said that old-growth forest is not going to be managed. So actively managed forests are by definition excluded from that. GCUs are actively managed. I think the problem arises, he doesn't see the issue. I think the problem arises when the GCU is within an area that might be defined as old growth forest. But I'd like to ask Mariana what she thinks about that particular issue.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, I think the issue arises when there is already a GCU and that area, that forest is then now it will be defined as an old growth forest. And you know, one of the minimum requirements from the, I was a national focal point for the EUFORGEN before. So I know that one of the minimum requirements is that active management should be allowed in GCUs just because just to maintain these evolutionary processes and also, you know, towards the effect on genetic diversity and management, it's not that clear cut, huh? I mean, definitely more studies would be needed, that we would know if management would affect genetic diversity, and with that, then how that is, would it diminish it or not, or increase? Yeah, more studies, including on more species, different management systems, because it's a difference if we are talking irregular shelter wood or clear cut, of course. and also including information from the whole genome's quantitative traits. But the information that we have so far, I've been doing this a few years back, looking at the literature and also doing studies in Slovenia. It just doesn't seem like there is really significant differences between forests managed in a close to nature way, closed canopy kind of thing, and non-managed forest. And actually, also we did a study in Slovenia looking at one of our primeval forests, beach in our primeval forest, and also a beach in a forest that was managed using irregular shelter wood. And we didn't see any significant differences in either genetic diversity or genetic structure. Now I have to say this was a molecular marker study with a limited number of markers, but still, I mean, also looking at the literature that is in kind of similar systems, there were no significant differences. So yeah, I hope that answers a little bit of the question.
It certainly does answer a little bit, which I think is all we can expect at the moment, is small pieces of answers to very big questions. I want to go to Marie Russinen now, because you mentioned examples where this has, where you have been able to change the nature of the genetic conservation unit in some ways to accommodate some small amounts of management. So how do you feel about this question that old growth forest is not to be managed, GCUs can be managed, there should be no conflict?
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, I mentioned that we have had the conflict, and I see it emerging again. The question and answer there actually makes a lot of sense to me, pointing out that if gene conservation units are managed, they shouldn't be eligible anymore to old growth forest. But I understand that this is a new program now emerging. We don't know all the details yet, and my experience is from national old forest conservation. And even within EU, I would say that we have seen cases where different countries interpret the regulations a bit differently. Also, one thing that has not been mentioned yet, I feel, is that the management requirements, the intensity of management to achieve the goals of genetic conservation depends a lot on the target species. So the whole selection of different cases is so wide that there will always be some where the conflict may emerge. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, do you think there is an objection then, maybe, that the management of a GCU will result in timber being placed on the market, so that there is maybe a conflict with the conservation management and the economic management of the GCU? Can you see an objection to timber from management going onto the market?
Indeed, I see it, and this is a nice question, and I think this is a little bit of emotional question as well. So I know that many people feel that harvesting wood, making economic income out of conservation unit should never be allowed by rule. And personally, I think that the determining factor we should look at carefully is if selling wood has a negative effect on the actual goal of conservation, which in this case is maintaining and enhancing genetic diversity in the target species. So if selling wood does no harm to that target, then why not? And in Finland, we have little resources for our genetic conservation program. And the key requirements for management of the unit is that we need to ensure abundant regeneration, and we always need to use the local origin. So if these two can be combined with so-called normal management, and then the forest owner gets their income, then it only makes our task easier. And then we can find the voluntary engagement that we so much need for this program. Thank you.
Okay, so it helps if there is an incentive for managers to do the management when necessary. I've had one of the questions that's come in. I'm going to slightly break here and ask Anna Maria if she'll address this question, because Andreas Rudolph has said, does it make sense to consider all target tree species the same way? So secondary tree species and dominant main tree species behave differently, and site diverse GCUs can certainly rejuvenate independently. And so conserving a large area, a large reserve area and a small GCU could be complementary approaches. And I wonder, Anna Maria, if you have something to say about that.
Thank you, Jeremy. I don't know if someone else from the panel would like to elaborate more on that. But what I would say is that, yes, we should check on all species at the same time. But of course, we cannot consider them the same way. So it can be that we have a GCU, we have many species there, and we need to address all of them at the same time to maintain the levels of genetic diversity, but also the same type of ecosystem.
Okay, so I mean, essentially that each species will require its own management program for conservation of genetic resources and also for more general conservation. Is that what, am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Does any of the other panelists want to speak to that question? Because otherwise I want to move to Brigitte and ask, you mentioned finding a solution to the potential conflict between strict conservation and management. And I just wondered, can you share what were the elements that you think that made reaching a resolution a solution? What were the elements that made that possible?
Yeah, well, I think that there are a number of factors can help to find a solution acceptable for everybody. First of all, I think it's important to be able to engage in discussion, to understand each other's needs and to listen each other. I think that is very very important. The nature protection, genetic protection, management, and sometime also natural park. All the people who are working, who are protecting, who are living in forest don't have the same idea and the same goal to this forest. So I think that is very important to engage the conversation and the discussion with everybody. In the case of France, I think that the existence of a National Commission on Genetic Resources, where the various stakeholders are together in a conservation and present, make it possible to be aware of the various conservation issues and also be able to discuss particular cases, like for the sandbomb. And it is very important to share different knowledge on scientific knowledge, the data on nature preservation, and to try to do our best to, in fact, the same goal, to conserve our biodiversity. And I think that another important element is that the units have been recognized also by IUCN as a conservation statute. So it is also important that our genetic diversity is concerning by statute of conservation at international level, and not only European one.
Thank you. Peter Loeffler, I wonder, you mentioned the existence already of considerable impacts from climate change, and I just wonder, have you considered how that is affecting the genetic conservation units themselves? I mean, we've talked about impacts on forests more generally, but are we seeing impacts on genetic conservation units from drought, from heat stress?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is what I tried to sort of indicate already before. I mean, we have sort of in climate adaptation, we have this definition of risk, and you know, which consists of three elements. There's the hazard, and that's the drought, that's the flood, that's too much, too little water, too hot, too cold, whatever. There's the exposure, and the exposure is what's in the way of the hazard. And then there's the vulnerability of what is exposed. And in our case, climate change is a given, a certain degree, and we will see strong and consistent warming throughout this century. So this is not the end, this is just the beginning. Forests are exposed, we cannot just move them like that, in most cases. You know, we can of course do ex situ conservation, but in most cases moving them is not. So they're exposed, and forests are highly vulnerable. We know that most tree species are highly vulnerable to unexpected sort of exceptional droughts, about 70%. And then they suffer from hydraulic failure and die really right from the drought away. We see new wildfire patterns. 40% actually of the wildfires this year occurred in Central and Northern Europe. So this is not anymore a Southern European issue. This is a pan-European problem. And my concern is really also that for the risk, it is also entscheidend, you know, what value do we risk to lose? And if there is a single genetic conservation unit, which is sort of isolated somewhere in the landscape and it's been affected by a wildfire and risks to be wiped out, then I think I would argue we have a very significant risk. And I think my question is, in your community also, are there reflections on this type of risks, or have you assessed them, or how do you plan to respond to them? To me, it's something which really in our preparatory discussions occurred to me as something which I didn't have on my mind yet, and that makes maybe also a wider point. I generally think the sort of your community, the community of your people in the room, it would be very important for yourself to project also yourself into the sort of the debates which we have on old growth forests, or on climate adaptation, or on risk assessments. I think that's really, it would be a shame if we found out only very, very late in the process that there is a major risk which we have overlooked, or like in old growth forests, you know, I just checked the working document, genetic, just the word genetic isn't there at all. And I'm not sure to what degree sort of your community was involved in this very open and very wide-ranging process of developing this document. And you seem to have a real issue with it. So I guess this is why I also try to broaden the debate a bit. I think we need to discuss maybe your issues also in this wider sense. Thank you.
But the question remains of the fact that old growth forests and genetic conservation units, in a way, are defined by different stakeholder groups. And how do you bring the two together? How do you get them both to recognize that each has an interest in the other?
Maybe if I can just chip in quickly, I think
Please.
there was really sort of a disconnect. This whole issue was new to me, and I'm not completely new in this field. So there's something broke down earlier. There wasn't enough communication, I thought.
Let me ask Mariana. You mentioned the decision support tool. I'm just wondering how that might help managers to consider threats to genetic conservation units.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. This is something that we've been working on in a EUFORGEN working group in the past term, and it was a process that took actually 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. And we've been discussing that in a group of a lot of people. Anna Maria showed the book itself. It's available as a report. And with that, we were discussing, what are the threats to the genetic conservation units, and what would be the indicators and verifiers that would signal those threats. And then based on the severity of the verifier or the value of the verifier, then we try to link that to a given management action. So we could manage to see how we could manage and what kind of silvicultural intervention would be needed to preserve these gene conservation units, to preserve its dynamic nature, so it would be able to adapt to the changes. And then in case, like, you have also a very, like Peter said, like a very unique gene conservation unit somewhere far away and it's prone to fire, in that kind of case, what would you do? How would you go from the dynamic in situ to ex situ? And what are the triggers that would cause, through indicators and verifiers, what are the triggers that would alarm you to go from one action to a more intensive action to ex situ conservation? And what Hans said in the beginning, I think I'm not, I don't know, maybe Anna Maria can explain that better, but I think the discussion is going to broaden now to include that decision support tool and how to adapt GCUs to climate change in more specific way in this next term. But yeah, the decision support tool is basically meant to help the managers to recognize the threats, to see them when they are happening, and to take actions in a early enough, but then also to record these decisions. So we can look back to what our decisions, what kind of consequences they had. So it's meant to be like that. In the framework of the ForGenius project, we are trying to put that decision support tool into the EUGES information system. So it's gonna, it will be easier to track what we are doing and how the gene conservation units are behaving, and also a little bit more, with the what are the threats in terms of fire and climate change. We are discussing that and trying to build that into the system, so it would become an integral tool where we would be actually able to track what is happening and know the dangers very early on. So.
Thank you, Mariana. That actually raises something that I wanted to ask Brigitte about, because with the beach populations that you were talking about, they're not quite relic populations, but they're far away from the main distribution. And I just wonder, what other approaches to conservation for those populations? Are you considering alternative methods of conservation of the genetic resources?
Yeah, well, the first, of course, is to maintain this unit with good practice of management in the sandboom. But we never know what could happen. A fire, the population is declining also. So what we try to do is to collect the seeds for several years, because we know that is not always the same trees who are flowering and fruiting each year. So, and then we try to what Mariana said, to do pseudo ex situ conservation. I say pseudo ex situ because we are planting these seedlings in beech forest in the north of France. So what really we try to do is to do the both, really do all what we can do in the forest, in the units, but also to propose to conserve when it is possible the seeds for long term, but also to plant seedlings in other conditions to preserve a part, not all the genetic diversity, but a part of this diversity for long term.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Marie, with your long experience in Finland, I'm just wondering if you could share an example of solving the conflict between genetic conservation and habitat conservation. You must have some.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your confidence in us. Yes, indeed, we don't only have problems, we also have solutions. And okay, first of all, it all depends a lot on the species, and maybe I would like to mention a case where we had a lime, Tilia cordata, gene conservation forest in an island in one of our lakes, and that area was then transferred, or it got nature conservation status, and we were very worried. But for the act for that specific island, we managed to negotiate in the act a text allowing for removing Norway spruce in order to promote Tilia cordata, because that was kind of joint value for the nature conservation side and for us. So the target species was the same, and that made it easier. We also have a case where a very rare moss was found in one of our Norway spruce gene conservation stands, and that moss required no management environment, very intact environment, and also we were about to lose that unit, but then by very lucky chance there was a possibility to acquire some new land. It was state land north from the original unit, and we kind of managed to draw the borders again, and then there was room for the moss and room for genetic conservation of Norway spruce. So yes, the two or more administrative public officers are able in Finland to negotiate and also find solutions. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. I think although we have a few minutes more, I think I'm going to start wrapping up by noting that what you just said, Marie, is that either when there's a joint focus on one species, or where it's possible for two different agencies, two different stakeholders to see the value of both of them compromising to get both of their goals, to satisfy both of their goals, it is possible. This doesn't need to be a conflict every time, but it requires, as I think everybody has said, it requires listening. It requires asking to be heard and asking for opinions on these various proposals. Unless I see any other, I'm just looking quickly. I see, I mean, a question I think is more of a comment. Let me just say then, thank you everybody for your contributions. I remind you again that this is being recorded and will be shared in full later. the processes that are going on. You can be informed if you keep up to date with EUFORGEN and Forest Europe. And so I'd like to thank Jens Höfler and Anna Maria Foster-Lulu and all of the panelists for their contributions, and EUFORGEN to enabling this meeting. And thank you all very much, and see you again. Goodbye and thank you.